She wasn't born into royalty. She didn't come with riches, armies, or energy. Just an orphan raised in exile, a foreign lady, dwelling below the rule of thumb of the sector's most effective empire. But she became chosen, not through danger, no longer with the aid of splendor alone. She became located through divine cause, hidden behind palace walls for this kind of time as this. However, at the same time as kings drank from golden cups and nobles plotted in mystery, a quiet battle became brewing, one that wouldn't be fought with swords or chariots. However, with fasting, faith, and the bravery to talk when silence ought to suggest death, her name changed into Esther, and this isn't just the tale of a queen. It's the story of the way God stored a people via the most not-going of heroes. Within the days of King Xerxes, who dominated over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, his power stretched across the known international. From his throne in Susa, he reigned with absolute authority. To display his greatness, Xerxes held a lavish dinner party for 180 days, inviting nobles, princes, and navy leaders from across the empire. Gold goblets and royal wine flowed freely. Whilst those 6 months ended, the king opened the palace gates to anybody in Susa, website hosting a 7-day dinner party within the lawn courtyard. Wine turned into served generously, with no restrictions. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti hosted a separate ceremonial dinner for the ladies within the palace. But on the 7th day, when the king became merry with wine, he made a prideful demand that Queen Vashti be added earlier than the visitors, sporting her royal crown so they may admire her beauty. Vashti refused. She might now not parade herself before a drunken crowd. The king's satisfaction became wounded. His own queen had publicly defied him. Enraged and humiliated, Xerxes became to his smart guys. One consultant, Memicon, warned that her defiance could unfold. He said, "All women will hear of this and dishonor their husbands." They entreated the king to dispose of Vashti in difficulty, a decree at some point of the empire, that each guy should rule his personal family. The king agreed. A royal edict was sent to each province in every language, and Queen Vashti turned into dethroned. But little did they recognize God's unseen hand had just all started to move. As time surpassed, King Xerxes' anger faded, and he started to mirror on Queen Vashti, her beauty, her formidable defiance, and the decree that banished her. Though the regulation could not be undone, her absence lingered. Sensing the king's mood, his advisors proposed an answer. Allow lovely young virgins be delivered from each province. After beauty remedies, the king can choose a brand new queen to replace Vashti. The king agreed. Messengers had been sent throughout all 127 provinces, and young ladies were accumulated from every nook of the empire, from India to Ethiopia. Among them became Hadassah, regarded by means of her Persian call Esther, a young Jewish orphan raised through her cousin Mordecai, a Jew residing in Susa. He had taught her to fear God and maintain her identity hidden in an overseas land. Esther changed into taken to the palace and located underneath Haggai, the keeper of the girls. Immediately she stood out, no longer via worrying luxurious, but through humility and charm. God gave her favor in everybody's eyes, especially Haggai's. For 365 days, Esther, like all the ladies, became prepared for her one appearance earlier than the king. When her time got here, entered the king's presence with quiet dignity and power. And whilst Xerxes saw her, he turned into captivated. The king loved Esther greater than all of the other girls. She gained his favor, and he located the royal crown on her head, making her queen in place of Vashti. A royal banquet became held in her honor. A vacation became proclaimed, and presents had been dispatched throughout the empire. However, nobody knew she turned into a Jew. Nobody knew God had simply located his servant in the palace, now not to be served, but to face inside the gap for his people. Esther endured to live quietly inside the king's residence, nevertheless following the commands of Mordecai, just as she had while he raised her as a child. Mordecai, meanwhile, spent his days on the king's gate, a place in which the metropolis's commercial enterprise became carried out and wherein royal officers and servants accrued. Though he changed into no nobleman, God had located him there with motive. At some point, as Mordecai sat in his typical location, he overheard something chilling. Of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the doorway to the palace, have been speaking me in hushed, angry tones. Their voices low but complete of resentment. They plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What they intended was treason. the murder of the most effective guy within the global. Mordecai didn't hesitate. He dispatched phrase without delay to Queen Esther, who now had direct get entry to the king. Esther relayed the warning to Xerxes, certainly declaring that the information came from Mordecai, and research become released. The problem was examined very well, and the reality was exposed. The two guards had been guilty. They had certainly conspired towards the king, and via Persian regulation, the punishment for such betrayal turned into quick and brutal. They had been hanged on the gallows. The king's lifestyles become spared, however the second passed without fanfare. Mordecai's role in exposing the plot changed. Recorded in the Book of the Chronicles, a royal report of massive activities saved in the king's presence. But unusually, no praise was given, no public honor, no popularity, no name. Only a call in a e-book quietly inked into the data of the empire. After a while, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite to the very best rank amongst his officers. All were ordered to bow to him, however Mordecai refused. Each day, Haman saw his defiance and burned with anger. Whilst he learned that Mordecai became a Jew, Haman's hatred grew deeper. He didn't simply need to punish Mordecai. He desired to break all Jews all through the empire. Haman cast lots Purim to choose the day. Then he approached the king with deceitful words. There's a positive human scattered through your provinces. They live differently and don't observe your legal guidelines. It's now not to your hobby to tolerate them. The king agreed, giving Haman his signet ring. A royal decree was dispatched to all 127 provinces on the 13th day of the 12th month. Each Jew, old and young, become to be killed. Because the couriers unfold the message, Susa fell into confusion. Mourning broke out the various Jews. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his garments, placed on sackcloth and ashes, and wept bitterly in the streets of Susa. Throughout the empire, Jews fasted, mourned, and cried out as their destruction had been sealed. When Esther heard Mordecai became in mourning, she dispatched a messenger to him to discover why. Via the messenger, Mordecai urged her to go before the king and plead for her human beings. But Esther changed into afraid. She replied, "No person may approach the king without being summoned. The penalty is dying except he holds out the golden scepter, and that I haven't been called for 30 days. Mordecai's answer to the messenger changed into ambitious. Do not think you may escape in the palace. In case you live silent, deliverance will come from elsewhere. However, you and your circle of relatives will perish. And who is aware of, perhaps you had been made queen for any such time as this." Esther's fear gave way to religion. She answered, "Pass. Collect all the Jews in Susa, speedy for me for 3 days. I will go to the king, even though it fees me my existence. If I perish, I perish." On the 1-3 day, wearing her royal gowns, Esther courageously entered the inner courtroom of the palace. The king saw her status there and extended the golden scepter towards her. With comfort and hope, Esther touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked warmly, "What is your request, Queen Esther? Even up to half of the kingdom it is going to be granted." Esther responded, "If it pleases the king, come to a ceremonial dinner I've prepared for you and Haman." The king smiled, intrigued by using her invitation, and with ease agreed. And each he and Haman attended Esther's dinner party. But in the course of the meal, Esther did now not speak of her petition. As an alternative, she observed the king closely, her eyes attempting to find the proper moment. Earlier than the meal ended, Esther prolonged any other invitation. "Please come again the next day, after which I'm able to share my proper request." The king's hobby deepened, and Haman's curiosity grew, each eager and uncertain approximately what Esther's plea is, probably. That night, King Xerxes lay wakeful, stressed and bothered. Nothing should soothe his mind, not the royal wine, nor the comforts of his palace. Desperate for distraction, he ordered his servants to convey the e-book of the Chronicles, the professional file of the kingdom's occasions. Because the scribe's study, the king's eyes caught an extended forgotten entry, Mordecai's call. The record told how Mordecai had uncovered a plot against the king's life, an act of loyalty that had stored Xerxes from assassination. But notwithstanding the gravity of this deed, Mordecai had by no means been rewarded. Deeply moved, Xerxes requested his advisors, "What honor or reputation has been given to Mordecai for this?" The advisor answered, "Nothing has been finished for him. The king sat in thoughtful silence. How ought such loyalty go unrewarded? At that very moment, Haman entered the palace, proceeding to invite the king for permission to dangle Mordecai on a gallows he had built. But before he should speak, the king summoned him in. "Haman," the king said, "what must be achieved for the man the king delights to honor?" Puffed up with conceitedness, Haman imagined the king meant him. He responded with an in-depth plan. "Let the person be clothed in the king's royal gowns, which the king himself has worn. Let a royal crown be located on his head, and allow him be led at the king's personal horse through the town streets. A noble official ought to ride before him, proclaiming, 'This is what is completed for the person the king delights to honor.'" The king smiled and said, "Pass without delay. Do the whole lot you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect whatever." Haman's face grew to become faded, his coronary heart pounding with dread. He was forced to carry out the honor he had deliberate for himself, but rather it changed into given to his enemy. Humbled and bitter, Haman led Mordecai via the city streets, proclaiming his honor just as he had described. When he again home, his spirit turned into beaten. He informed his wife and buddies everything that had passed off, his anger and humiliation clear. They warned him, "If Mordecai is of Jewish origin, you will not stand towards him. You will genuinely come to break." And so, Haman's plot to destroy the Jews grew darker. However, his delight had already been wounded with the aid of the king's surprising favor towards Mordecai. At the second banquet Esther had prepared, the king and Haman took their seats all over again beside the queen. King Xerxes checked out her carefully and requested all over again. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" "Speak, to your wish will be granted, even to 1/2 of the dominion." With braveness and conviction, Esther spoke her heart. "If I've discovered favor on your sight, O king, and if it pleases you, grant me my existence. That is my petition, and spare my humans. That is my request." The king's expression shifted, a flash of shock crossing his face. Esther continued, "For we have been offered, distressed I and my human beings, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Had we simply been sold as slaves and servants, I'd have kept silent, for no such distress might justify troubling the king." The king's face darkened in shock and anger. He demanded, "Who is he? And in which is the person who might dare do this type of component?" Esther pointed to Haman, announcing, "The adversary and enemy is that this depraved man," and raged past measure. King Xerxes rose and left the ceremonial dinner corridor to chill his fury. Meanwhile, Haman turned in terrified. Seeing the king's anger and figuring out his plot had been exposed, he rushed to beg Esther for mercy. In desperation, he fell at the sofa wherein Esther became reclining. He clung to her, pleading for his existence. At that moment, King Xerxes again suddenly. He noticed Haman clinging to Esther and shouted, "Will he even attack the queen even as I'm within the residence?" The king's guard seized Haman, and he became rapidly led away and hanged on the very gallows he had organized for Mordecai. Thus, the plans of the depraved had been overturned in an unmarried second, and justice became served. After Haman became hanged, King Xerxes gave his whole property to Queen Esther. She, in flip, appointed Mordecai over it. The king also removed his signet ring, once given to Haman, and placed it on Mordecai's hand, giving him royal authority. But the danger wasn't over. Even though Haman became lifeless, his decree remained law. In Persia, a royal edict sealed with the king's ring couldn't be revoked, not even through the king himself. The day of destruction against the Jews nonetheless loomed at the calendar, the 13th day of the 12th month. So Esther once again approached the king, this time no longer for her life, but for the life of her humans. "How can I undergo to peer catastrophe fall on my human beings?" she pleaded. King Xerxes granted permission for a new decree to be written, one that would counter the first. Mordecai fast summoned the royal scribes and wrote in the king's call, "The Jews in every town have the right to collect and protect themselves. They will ruin each person who assaults them, and take their enemies' goods if needed." This decree changed into sent out rapidly to all 127 provinces in every language, sealed with the king's ring. As it spread, desire was revived. Wherein there were mourning, now there was mild and gladness. On the appointed day, the Jews stood united throughout the empire. With royal protection and new determined courage, they rose up and defeated their enemies. In Susa, 800 attackers were struck down, which includes Haman's 10 sons, infamous guys who had stood by means of their father's depraved plans, who were later hanged at Esther's request. Esther also asked for one more day of defense in Susa, and the king granted it. Throughout the empire, 75,000 enemies were defeated. Over again, the Jews took no plunder. Their fight changed into for survival, now not gain. It became not an afternoon of greed, it became a day of justice. When the warfare was over, the people rested, and what began as a day of dread became a day of victory and birthday celebration. To don't forget their deliverance. The Jews established a yearly celebration known as Purim, named after the lots Haman had cast to devise their destruction, now an image of God's reversal. Each year on the 14th and 15th of Adar, they could feast, have a good time, send gifts to one another, and provide generously to the poor. A day that was as soon as marked for death became an afternoon of existence. Mourning turned to joy. Grief grew to become to party. Mordecai turned into honored in the course of the empire, clothed in royal blue and white, second handiest to King Xerxes. But it wasn't his strength that made him tremendous. It turned into his coronary heart. He sought the good of his people and spoke peace and reality to all. And even though God's call is never stated in the entire book of Esther, his fingerprints are anywhere in each twist, every danger, each rescue. What becomes supposed for destruction, God used for salvation. The tale of Esther reminds us, even if God appears silent, he is in no way absent. Even when the percentages are towards us, he's already at paintings. Perhaps you too are wherein you are for this sort of time as this. Now, not by using accident, not unseen, however selected, placed, and known as, due to the fact that God who reversed the fate of a nation still writes memories of redemption these days, and yours might be subsequent.